I know you've got an ear out for the start of the podcast, but before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to remind you to keep an eye out for Darryl Lee's limited edition Christmas treats, because they're in stores now. Like the iconic Christmas nougat pudding, so yummy and a gorgeous little gift. And some delicious Chrissy-themed twists on your favourite treats, like the Darryl Lee Rockley Road with chewy red and green jelly pieces, green and red crunchy milk chocolate balls, my favourites, and green apple and strawberry flavoured licorice. Watch them disappear. Your Christmas treats table will pop with colour and scrumptiousness. Spread some joy, bring the fun, and enjoy the Christmas tradition that is Darryl Lee. Hurry before they sell out. Darryl Lee makes Christmas better.
You're listening to a DM podcast.
Welcome to The Five of My Life with me, Nigel Marsh. As an author, adman and theologian, I've always been interested in people's stories. Not just those with a high profile, but people from all walks of life, regardless of fame. Which is why I created this show. Each guest who takes the 5 of My Life challenge chooses a favourite film, book, song, place and possession. They tell me their choices in advance so I can research them, but they don't tell me why they've chosen them. That's the subject of our conversation. It's amazing what you can learn when discussing someone's 5 choices. I hope you enjoy listening to the show as much as I enjoy making it. Ross Coulthart is a 5-times winner of Australia's National Journalism Prize, the Walkley Award. Winner of a Gold Logie for Best Public Affairs TV Reporting, and winner of a Gold Medal for International Investigative Journalism at the New York Film Festival. Alongside his 3 decades of multi-award-winning journalism, Ross is also the best-selling author of 6 books. Always interested in unearthing a good story, Ross's latest book, In Plain Sight, is a fascinating investigation into the controversial subject of UFOs. So Ross, welcome to 5 of My Life.
It's a pleasure to be here, Nigel.
Well, mate, on your website, there's a quote that's pulled out in highlights that says you are always interested in a good story, and that is what we are about here at 5 of My Life. And your choices, your first 3, are taking us through the 70s, 80s and 90s.
I'm showing my age.
And we are starting, as we always do on 5 of My Life, with the Steven Spielberg 1978 Empire of the Sun movie. Tell us why you've chosen that on 5 of My Life.
I only ever saw Empire of the Sun the first time when I was about 25 years old, and I found myself weeping on the sofa watching it. And
why were you weeping?
Because it's a story about a little boy who got separated from his parents in Manchurian China when the Japanese invaded, and he was put away in a prisoner of war camp or a detention camp during the war. And this actually happened. It happened to J.G. Ballard, the novelist who wrote the book that inspired the film. And it's funny because I don't know whether you are a victim of this, but I was a victim at the age of 9 years old of being sent away to boarding school, private boarding school.
5 for me.
Right. And I remember this incredible sense of dislocation and isolation that in those days they thought built resilience in young boys. And I just remember it completely destroyed the relationship I had with my parents. And there's a great moment at the end of Empire of the Sun where the Jim character, the boy, is looking for his parents, and they're doing these reunions. I'm crying thinking about it, you know. And his mother and father are looking through the crowd after 3 or 4 years of war for their little boy. And of course he's grown up. And I think the actor who played him is Christian Bale. I think it's Christian's best ever performance. And there's this sad moment when his mother recognises him and he can barely make her out. And it was that point I can remember. I was 25 years old and I'd locked it all up for, whatever it was, 8 or 9 years. And all those feelings of isolation and divorce from my family and my parents came flooding back. I would never put my kids through private boarding school. It's a horror of a thing to do to a child. And, I love my parents deeply and respect them for the decisions they made. But, oh, my God, was it a misguided decision?
Wow. I mean, I didn't know that about you. And that is one of my Kate thinks, my wife thinks I've never recovered.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah.
And what I say to all my progressive trendy friends who are in the therapy is I'm scared to go to therapy. So I think repression gets a bad press. I have locked it all up.
Yeah.
At the age of 5, you're sent away. I mean, my school, unfortunately, run by a paedophile, Robin Lindsay.
There were paedophiles at my school. I mean, there was a good mate of mine. I will never name him, of course, but he came to me a few years ago and said he wanted me to help find the paedophile who'd raped him at school. Yeah. And we ended up getting onto the police force in another country and informing them about this guy. And guess what? He was running a lolly shop.
No, don't. So how many brothers and sisters have you got?
I've got 3 sisters and 1 brother.
And were they all shipped off to boarding school?
Yeah, we all were.
And where?
All in New Zealand. So my dad was convinced there was going to be a nuclear war, and so we emigrated from the UK when I was a little boy. And he moved to New Zealand. Very wise decision, actually. It's a beautiful country, and I grew up there riding horses and walking in the bush and learning how to live on the land, and it was a great childhood. So
the decision, because my folks, I give them a free pass because they were military. And if you're a military, and we don't have any money, if you're a sort of a poor military family, you got a choice between your I've got 1 brother, your 2 sons having 3 years German, 3 years American, 3 years Belgium, 3 years English education in the government school, and that might not be the best because where do you live? Or you go, it will be sort of solidity if they go to one place, which would be a boarding school prison run by a paedophile. But I can see why they go, are we going to move them around? But there were some people in my dormitory who, there's one person, I shouldn't laugh, it's just barbaric, who could see the lights of his parents' house through the door. You go, why have you sent him here?
Yeah,
you could go home for tea.
My parents lived half an hour away.
No.
I can tell you. I'll tell you one sorrowful story. I remember multiple times, because my mum and dad never understood the fact that they had to participate in school life, and they were very retarded, socially shy British people, and they hated the idea of coming to school functions. And so frequently I was the only boy on a weekend, and the whole school had gone out with their families to go around the town and do things, and frequently I was completely isolated. And look, I think it defined me, to be honest, because it did make me resilient in a horrible way. It made me emotionally brittle, and I learned with the love of my beautiful wife, Kerry, to actually learn how to overcome that. But the thing it does, I think, and it's interesting, you've had the same experience, men don't talk about it, but there is an entire generation of men who have been brutalised by the experiences of their childhood as children, isolated from the love of their families and their siblings. And I just think it's barbaric.
So I never knew this about you. We have lived parallel childhoods, and the truth, I mean, I imagine it was the same for you if your mum and dad were English, is you don't get help. You just suck it up. You say goodbye to your 5-year-old in shorts at an American airport, and you fly unaccompanied, BOAC, into the love and care of a paedophile for 15 weeks. You can't leave the school grounds.
Yeah.
We had people, we had people suiciding. We had people running away. I know people who have spent their latter life trying to prosecute the paedophile headmaster, and then he got dementia and he died. But they never, ever recovered. And for me, I don't want to go into the damage it's done me because it's sort of working for me, touching wood at the moment, locking it all away.
But the thing that fascinated me was when I came to Australia, because I'd lived in New Zealand for a large part of my life, everybody tried to identify through sport with me, like most Australians do. And I was always the swotty, deeply intellectual boy at school. And for that, I was brutally bullied.
Oh, mate.
And I remember I was thrown out of a second-story window and I suffered an injury to my arm. And I remember the headmaster, I'd actually said I wanted to make a complaint of assault. And the headmaster came to see me to sort of advise me, old chap, not a good idea. And I remember there was a cover-up. My parents were never even told. And I remember thinking, what an appalling institution. The moment where I just realised how evil it was when one of my very dear friends came to me and told me that he'd been sexually abused by the choir master. Yeah. And it was covered up. And I did an investigation for him to find out where this guy was. And it turned out this wretched bastard had gone through about 4 other boys' schools through this country and sexually abused boys. And he'd always been allowed to move on from each school. And this friend of mine had never told me what he'd been through. And I was a chorister with him. And the sad thing was he'd never shared his experience. And to this day, I don't think I could ever forgive that school. And I still get pleas for money to build their bloody chapel. And I'd rather put a bomb under it.
So there was a documentary made about my school and how he could possibly have been able to get away with it for his whole career. Right, he his father ran the school, and then when he left university, he became the deputy headmaster when his father died. It just you go, how could this be happen? And the police chief, really interesting, said that many of the parents didn't want to make a fuss.
Yeah.
So I remember my dad, who adored, brilliant, gorgeous, lovely man. But when I said to him, Dad, we used to have to call him Mr. Robin. Mr. Robin, he takes the boys' showers, and there's a rumour he's buggering the boys. I'm sure I didn't use that word then, right? He ruffled my hair and said, "What's wrong with my son that he hasn't chosen him?"
Oh my God!
Now he was. That is a military bloke who has no relationship with his children, no idea what to do, or indeed take it seriously.
It's like that Monty Python sketch, what's wrong with a good Rogering taking it?
It's sort of if he's passing his exams and he isn't, identifiably self-harming, well, let's not make a fuss.
But it really struck me because I worked briefly in the UK, and I was really struck by how the generation of people that I met in leadership and in positions at high levels in business, they were all traumatized like I was.
100%.
And there's I think there's a mutual sort of trauma survivor look that we all have with each other, a demeanor. And it's a guardedness. It's a kind of an emotional guardedness. And I freely admit, my friend, I've found it very hard to form good relationships and friendships.
I'm feeling a bit of a bromance now because me too. And there was some Colonel blimp idiot who I was talking to, this is 30 years ago, who was trotting out the line, "It builds character." And I said, "You know what, mate? You are right. It absolutely does. But what type of character? You moron. Of course it builds character. You've got a choice. You go, I'm 5. There are people killing themselves, running away, being buggered by the headmaster. I'm either going to sink or swim, so I will swim and try and make a success of it and go with it. But I'd rather not be a really resilient, resourceful 5-year-old. I'd rather have a teddy bear and be tucked up at bed by mum and dad."
There's a friend of mine who's now a cabinet minister in another country, and I remember weeping myself to sleep because I was so homesick. And I remember he was an identical twin, and he was cuddling his brother, and both of them were crying for their parents.
No, don't.
And I think they were 8.5 and I was 9, and none of us could understand why we'd been sent away to this bloody school. God help these poor people if they haven't fixed themselves up, how they deal with their children. That's the issue.
Yeah. So, second choice, mate. We're moving from the 70s to the 80s, and I've got this monstrous, huge tome in front of me. Wow. Pulitzer Prize-winning classic, A Bright Shining Lie, Neil Sheehan, is that how you pronounce it? Sheehan. About the Vietnam War. It melted my brain. Tell me why you chose that on Find My Life.
It's the book that probably more than any other piece of journalism influenced my decision to go into journalism. Neil Sheehan was the guy who was leaked the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, who's a man who only died a few weeks ago. And Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, and Neil was the beneficiary. And it was the revelation of research that had been suppressed by the Pentagon, the US Defense Department, which showed just how wrong and badly conducted and misguided the Vietnam War was. And it fascinated me because I'm intrigued by the relationship that Neil Sheehan built with his source, a guy called John Paul Vann. Vann was an absolute superhero in the eyes of most of his colleagues in Vietnam. He'd started out in 1962 as a soldier, a combat soldier, as a lieutenant colonel with the US infantry. And he'd gone into conducting the war in the way that he was being told the war needed to be conducted to get rid of these damn pesky communists in Vietnam. And he very gradually, because he was a deeply intelligent working-class boy from rural Virginia, he began to realize that it was a completely misguided war. And as a lieutenant colonel, he developed positions of trust with very senior commanding generals, including General Westmoreland, the commanding general of Vietnam. And what happened, basically, was he quit as a soldier, as a combat soldier, and then came back, I think, in 1965 as an advisor with AID, which was essentially a development, a bit like our AusAid. And he eventually became the equivalent of a major general, tacitly running the war in collaboration with a South Vietnamese general. And he was probably the second or third most powerful person in Vietnam running this war. And sadly, he came to the growing realization that the war was utterly misconceived and misguided, that it was unwinnable on the conventional strategies. Because what they were doing, of course, was bombing the blazes out of Vietnam. They were destroying the loyalty in any kind of sense that the civilian population might have had, that the South Vietnamese government could be a legitimate government. And what they were doing was pushing them into the arms of the communists. And Neil Sheehan was a young correspondent based in Saigon covering the war for his newspaper. And John Vann was essentially the very senior officer who, like a lot of American officers do, took a very liberal view to briefing the media. It's something our military don't do in Australia. They're very guarded, and every officer in Australia is inculcated with a deep loathing and distrust of the media. But as I've found when I've embedded with Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan in combat zones, they're very willing to engage and to think privately about what they're thinking about the war. That's what inspired me. The story of John Paul Vann, the very senior officer who was running the war in Vietnam, and the journalist who was essentially his confidential confidant. It's had great echoes for me because I've covered wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as a reporter, and I have built friendships and relationships with very senior American officers, including one, a guy called Todd Clark, who, it's interesting, it's literally the 10th anniversary of his death. And Todd was a lieutenant colonel. I met him in Baghdad, in the streets of Baghdad, and because I'd just come back from inspecting a civilian area called Dora, where cluster bombs had been dropped. And it's interesting, the current debate that's going on as to whether or not the Americans should use cluster bombs with Ukraine. And I remember being disgusted that the Americans had dropped cluster bombs in a civilian area. And we interviewed a woman whose little boy had been killed when he was walking through this area of cluster bombs. We even found the canister that had contained these cluster bomblets, and it had the name of the factory in it. And we contacted the factory, and of course they didn't want to know anything about us. But I said, I just want you to know that your bomb killed a beautiful little boy who loved America, and his mother is weeping in Dora today. And anyway, as a result of walking through that battlefield, I met this guy called Todd Clark, who was killed in a blue-on-blue attack. He was shot by one of the Afghan soldiers that he was training 10 years ago, pretty much today. And the interesting thing is it had real parallels for me. I found it quite uncanny how I've gone into these places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and senior American commanders have actually said to me, the war is a folly. We don't know why we're here. It's crazy. What we're doing is we're ostracizing the population with our strategies. And the thing that Bright Shining Lie says to me is we've continued to fail all the way through. Our country has embraced the wars that America has taken us into since Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. We often demonize and make evil the people who conduct these wars, and they're often deeply intelligent men and women. And I've had conversations with people like a John Paul Vann, who I personally think was utterly misguided in his ideas that the Vietnam War could be won. I'm fascinated with the history of Vietnam and how not a lot of people know that Ho Chi Minh reached out to the CIA and said that he wanted to be a friend of America. Right. And because he was supposedly a communist, when in fact he was a nationalist, they rejected it. And that misguided application of US hatred of communism led to the polarization that led to the most disastrous war in recent history.
But how has it influenced your journalism?
It's made me deeply, deeply, deeply skeptical about the way that the media cheerleads foreign policy decisions like wars. I was deeply affected in 2003 when I was sent to Iraq by Channel 9. I was literally in Baghdad within a few weeks of the war, and it became very, very clear that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And we'd been told we had to go to Iraq as a coalition with the US to liberate these poor people from a tyrannical leader who was building nuclear weapons. And it was a lie. And worse still, there were people in the US intelligence community who knew that the intelligence that this was based on, it was bollocks. They knew that it was doubtful. It was information that came from a guy called Ahmed Chalabi, who ran the Iraqi National Congress, the INC, which was a very Iran-allied lobby group inside Iraq. And ironically, Iraq is now more closely aligned with Iran because of the folly of the American foreign policy in Iran. In the same way that the war in Vietnam was a disastrous war because it essentially threw Vietnam into the arms of the Soviets. And, it's only because the Vietnamese are more rapacious capitalists than we are that they've basically embraced the West as well. And we now do trade and thankfully have good friendships with them. And the thing is, we haven't learned the lessons of what Neil Sheehan's book describes.
Who is the American politician who tried to get a law passed that you could only vote on going to a land war if you had a son or daughter serving in the Teeth Arm?
I can't remember. Was it Edward Kennedy? I can't remember.
So brilliant.
It's a great idea.
Isn't that fact? You go, it's very, someone else is going to die. And there's one of the stories in here that the awful My Lai, the village where 500, that's just appalling. Everyone knows about it. But you go, that massacre of women and babies by the American troops in that appalling instance, you go, well, so that was 500 people that because there was a newsman there and you saw it and it was you can identify. You go, yeah, but the day before we killed 2,000 with a bomb from and the day before that we killed 3,000. And just because you could see it, that's what it means. It's real families having their heads blown off.
I think everybody in military college should be forced to read Neil Sheehan's book because John Paul Vann, whilst he was a misguided man, I believe, driven by an absolute hatred of communism, we're sitting at the very moment on the brink of war with China. I could not think of anything more insane. And there was a breath of fresh air the other day when Bob Carr, the former foreign minister, came out and actually said he doesn't think a Chinese invasion of Taiwan warrants the consequences that would ensue if Australia allied itself with America and went to war with China. It's insane.
It is insane, and we're going to leave the insanity and we're going to move you from the 80s to the 90s to your song on 5 of My Life, and you have chosen one of my wife's favourite songs, the Ship Song.
Come sail your ships around me and burn your bridges down. We make a little history, baby, every time you come around.
Tell us why you have chosen that on 5 of My Life, Ross.
I love Nick Cave because he's a deeply spiritual man and he's very open about his belief in God. I'm not a Christian myself, but I admire the fact that he's welcome to talk about it and he's open about it. And I also love the Ship Song because it's an expression of love, and it's the song that my wife and I played at our wedding for our wedding dance.
How did you meet the fantastic, delightful Kerry?
Kerry and I were both covering Chuck and Di. They were visiting Sydney. I was following Harry Arnold and Arthur Edwards from the London Sun for Young Events program at Channel 9. And we were doing a story about the tabloid British press chasing the royals. Right. And Kerry was the very proper and incredibly hard-working 2GB Macquarie radio news reporter doing live reports every 5 minutes. Yeah. And I remember hearing her describing Lady Di's dress, and it was something like a pink silk taffeta dress, and Kerry's going, "It's a pink silk taffeta dress with a bow on it?" And it was the expression of incredulity that she was doing on a live radio broadcast that made me realise I loved this woman. And we fell in love, and the rest is history.
What was it, a long courtship, or were you instant lovebirds?
No, I was really taken. I really admired. There was a great Andy Pavia did a profile once of the press gallery covering, I think, the Bob Carr premierial election, and Kerry was just this indefatigable ABC correspondent by that stage for the ABC TV News. Andy Pavia wrote, Kerry Douglas's quiet smile belies her awesome energy. And it was absolutely true because she was so hardworking. And it struck me that in journalism, women have to work 10 times harder than men do. And she was a classic illustration of that. She was working for this very blokey radio station where a lot of the execs were doing cocaine at lunchtime and going out for boozy lunches. And she was just this absolute stalwart. And this is back in the days when commercial radio really did make the best journalism in Australia. They were breaking stories, and she was very proud to be part of it. And she was doing the same at the ABC as well.
And how long have you been married?
33 years, I think.
Oh, mate, parallel lives, 31. Fantastic. Now, you mentioned religion. Every song that is chosen on Five My Life gets put on the Spotify Five My Life playlist.
Great.
It's a fantastic playlist because it's obviously completely eclectic. The
Sure.
algorithms couldn't give it to you. But the ship song is already on it.
Oh, really? Terrific.
Now, you mentioned religion. Rabbi Jeffrey Kemmins chose it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
A sensational song. And your religious journey, atheist from year dot, or?
Look, as you probably know, anybody who's been through a private boys' boarding school becomes irreligious from the very moment that they have religion thrust down their throat.
This is your plan for me?
But, you know, I still remember I had a great chaplain at school, Reverend Latham, and he was a lovely man, and he recognised in me that I was interested in spiritual ideas, but I loathed the bullshit of conventional religion. And I used to ask questions like, why do we have to believe in God? And if we don't have faith, isn't that anti-scientific? Aren't you telling us in the rest of our classes that we have to apply the scientific method? Why do we have to suspend judgment with the belief in a supreme intelligence? And he was great because he would intellectually engage.
Now, your fourth choice. I love the way people respond to the choices on Five My Life because you can be creative with it. So people have chosen my bathtub. One of my guests chose in the middle of a sentence when I'm writing. And you have chosen, you tricky trickster, anywhere in New Zealand's bush.
I, as a young boy, didn't realise how much I loved being in the outdoors. And for me, the most incredible thing I ever did at school was the Duke of Edinburgh Award, where we were sent out and I was the nerdy little SWAT, the intellectual SWAT. But I loved the idea of learning how to navigate. And so I was the navigator for the orienteers that I was with. And we hiked pretty much my entire teenage years, most of the great walks of New Zealand. So I spent a large part of my school days under canvas, hiking and exploring. And we had teachers who were wonderful people who encouraged us to push ourselves. And I remember we stayed in a snow cave on the side of Mount Cook, and we were way up in the Southern Alps, and we knew that if we went outside, we would literally be blown off the ridge. It was so exciting. And so when I see the New Zealand tourism ads these days for Aotearoa, I tear up. I really do. I miss the New Zealand bush intensely. And whilst I love Australia, Australia's given me all the opportunities that I've sought and tried to achieve. There's something about the New Zealand bush that is mystical to me. And I have a love, because as a little boy I used to go hiking in the bush with Māori friends and Pākehā friends, and there was an affinity. I remember the little Māori boys that I was with would touch the trees and they would talk to the tree spirits as they walked through the bush. And it was the most normal thing in the world to me, the idea that a child could communicate spiritually with something in the bush. And there's a mysticism about the New Zealand bush that I love, and as much as I can, I'd love to get back there more often.
The parallels are, quite frankly, spooky. So you've done the Milford Track?
Yes, I have, yeah.
So I did that, 10 years ago, and one of the most remarkable, fun, enjoyable weeks, the whole trip of my life.
I used to cut that every summer. My job briefly was to be one of the people who helped clear the track and make it ready for posh customers like you.
So Kate and I did it in a posh, glampy way, but then I enjoyed it so much and liked the New Zealand countryside so much that for my 60th birthday, my deep desire, which has been arranged, is that I go off and do the Abel Tasman.
Take a raincoat. That's my best advice to you.
Okay. well, so apparently it's not as hilly, but it involves a bit of kayaking. And just for me, just the vibe of I'm going to go to a beautiful place and walk through it and chat to my wife. You go, it's my idea of a perfect holiday.
Yeah, one of the first things I ever did with Kerry was I took her to Mount Cook, and we were running through grass, and I was doing a kind of a, this is the sound of music, the hills are alive, the sound of music. And she was going, Ross, be careful for snakes. And I was going, there are no snakes in New Zealand. And that's one of the joys in New Zealand is you can literally lie down in the tundra, you can push your way through the bush, and there is practically nothing that can kill you.
Yeah.
And that's the joy of New Zealand. It really is. It's a prehistoric place. And I love the incredible strength of the Māori people and the way that they as a student at law school there, I studied the Treaty of Waitangi under Geoffrey Palmer, who went on to become the New Zealand Prime Minister. And Geoffrey, to his great credit, finally, as Attorney General and Prime Minister, pushed through the enactment of the Treaty of Waitangi to make it law. And a lot of my Maori friends who were selling dope at the Lord Vestey Patea Freezing Works when I was a little boy, they're now huge landowners because they've been able to regain some of the land that they lost under the treaty.
We're moving from earthly outdoors to outer earthly outdoors because your fifth choice on 5 My Life, which is always the possession, it's often my favourite of my guests' choices. You have, and I quote, chosen a signed Apollo 14 patch signed by astronaut and lunar module pilot Edgar Mitchell when he went to the moon. Mate, we haven't had one of those before. Tell us about it.
I've written a book about UFOs. UAPs, as they're more politely known, unidentified anomalous phenomena. And
that's not going to catch on. It's UFOs, mate.
Yeah, it's UFOs. Right. And I wrote a book called In Plain Sight, which is still in the bookshops, and it's being re-released actually in September in the US, and it's become a hugely popular issue. I've done documentaries about it as well. And one of the stories I tell in my book is I met a source called the Spaceman, who had access to Dr. Edgar Mitchell's archives after he died. And the Spaceman was one of Edgar's closest friends. And I have to use a pseudonym because he asked to remain anonymous. But the Spaceman essentially gave me a document which has become one of the most controversial documents in recent UFO history, because it purports to record a conversation between a former head of the US Defense Intelligence Agency, Admiral Tom Wilson, and a guy called Dr. Eric Davis, about what is alleged to be a crash retrieval program where the US allegedly recovered non-human craft, and that this has been secretly withheld from the public for 60, 70 years. And that's what I've been investigating for a lot of the last few years. I left 60 Minutes about 5 years ago, and I looked around and thought, what's a book I want to tell? What's the most stigmatized and taboo subject in the world? UFOs. And to my shock, when I started talking to people in US defense and intelligence, rather than poo-pooing the subject and saying it's all rubbish and these craft that people are seeing are really some kind of secret American technology, they started telling me, look, it's real. There is a real phenomenon. There's a mystery there. And so one of my sources, the Spaceman, who'd been a close personal friend of Edgar Mitchell, who gave me this document, which essentially shows and records the alleged investigations by one person into this purported crash retrieval program and reverse engineering program that allegedly is still going on inside the US government and private aerospace. The Spaceman also had a very coveted patch that Edgar Mitchell literally wore all the way to the moon. And I was awestruck when, as a result of our friendship, he gave it to me. And the idea of actually having something in my possession which has actually been to the moon is extraordinary. And I'm fascinated by that amazing period of American exceptionalism that you and I grew up with as children, where America funded the Apollo space program. And it defined a lot of my childhood. I remember looking up at the moon and thinking, wow, there are people on that object right now. And I remember thinking what an incredible achievement it was and how amazing America was. And it wasn't until much later in my adolescence that I came across this book, which told me about the problems and issues with American foreign policy. And it fascinated me as a journalist how, on the one hand, this great country could do such an incredible thing as to achieve the technological marvel of getting humans safely to the moon and back and making this incredible discovery for all humankind. And yet, on the other hand, it could find itself, because of stupid, illogical decision-making, irrational decisions, trapped in wars that even now it acknowledges were serious mistakes.
To close the loop on that, because to bring it back to your second choice, is dear old Edgar. There's a wonderful quote. It really messed with his head seeing the Earth from space.
The overview effect.
Yes. Well, one of his quotes is, "You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty." In that you go, mate, it's a small little tennis ball in a huge, vast universe, and you're squabbling over, where we draw the line on the bloody map. I mean, lads, talk about missing the point.
So just a month ago, to sort of add the dot, if you like, to the conclusion of my investigations into UFOs, I've continued my investigations. And just a month ago, I did an interview in America with a guy called David Grush, who was a very senior, very, very well-informed senior intelligence officer with the American National Geospatial Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office. Very brilliant man. And he has made the allegation, and he's willing to testify publicly about it, that the US is, as Edgar Mitchell alleged, and as that memo that I was given by the spaceman alleges, the US is allegedly in possession of non-human technology. And this story's gone around the world in the last few weeks, and I'm still ridiculed by some of my media colleagues for following this story up. But if they only knew the people like David Grush, who I'm talking to, people inside the US military and intelligence community and private aerospace, who are telling me that this is real. And that if we do want to learn of thinking of ourselves as humans and not just as Australians or Chinese, Russian or American, one of the best ways of doing that would be to answer that fundamental question: are we alone?
Yeah.
And that's why I think, as a journalist, it's the most important story of all. And yet so much of the media giggles.
Yeah. Well, no, I would imagine that 80% of my gorgeous listeners would go, "Serious, gorgeous, lovely Ross has gone. He's gone troppo. Oh my God, he's talking about UFOs." I mean, you are bloody delightful and extraordinarily intelligent and very, very good at what you do. And so it needs people as credible as you to do it, because if you are sort of swivel-eyed, hair sticking everywhere, bloke living in the mountains, you will be dismissed completely. Yeah. You'll just be dismissed a little bit.
Well, the good thing, Nudge, is that we're going to get an answer.
Right.
Because the US Congress, people don't realise this, the US Congress has actually passed laws that require the Pentagon, the intelligence community and private aerospace to
release the spaceship.
But there's a bipartisan push now in the Congress that literally, in black and white, demands that aerospace companies reveal any unidentified anomalous phenomena material or, quote, non-Earth tech that they have in their possession.
How good are you going to feel when you are vindicated?
I'm looking forward to it greatly. No, because I mean, it's interesting because there's a dissonance between what people treat this subject like in public and the private attitudes of people that I speak to literally all the time. A lot of people say, you can't keep secrets. Governments can't keep secrets. Governments leak. And believe me, they can.
Yeah. Not for much longer. God, I've loved talking to you. I didn't know we had those things in common. So is there something, a misunderstanding about you that you would like to correct? Because if there is, now's the time to do it, mate. You've got the talking stick.
I think a lot of my friends maybe think I'm very unemotional and very remote. And I hope that what I've told you today explains a lot more of what I really am.
What a great answer, because I think it has, because I've known you for a while, and I think you are a bit of a strange cove, slightly remote.
A lot of people have said to me I'm quite intellectually aloof. I come across as a bit of a snob, and I think I'm better than everybody else, and I truly don't.
No.
What I am, I'm very guarded and shy. I'm a very, very shy, quite introverted person who by sheer dint of the fact that I love investigating things, I found myself in a very public role as an investigative journalist. And, sometimes as a journalist, you do things that are highly controversial, and it puts you in the public eye in a way that I find quite painful. And a lot of people mistakenly think that I'm arrogant about it, and I truly am not.
There was something on school sport, standing on the touchline. I like you, I overreacted to my parents never coming to anything of mine, of going to everything of my kids. And someone once said to Kay, "Oh, Nigel, he's aloof or arrogant or a wanker or something because he stands by himself, not with the other parents." And you go, "What? I'm terrified. I'd love,
Me too.
I'd love to go over and I wish they'd come and talk to me. Or, I'm not over there because I think I'm over there because I'm lonely and a bit awkward."
Yeah, no, it's funny actually because Kerry and I have just moved down to the Southern Highlands, or up to the Southern Highlands, and one of the joys I'm having is to take time to actually make friends.
Yeah.
And I've never had, I went into the gym the other day and this old codger waved at me and went, "Ross." And he's an old cop. He's an old SWAS cop, and he knows me from journalism, and we recognised each other when I walked into the gym. And we've become mates. We've had a beer together, and it's nice.
I actually think for people who might have some of the trauma and issues that you and I might have, is that it does become easy when you're older because you have let go. I'm just me, right? So when you meet that bloke in the gym, you I would imagine, are not trying to prove anything. You're not trying to prove you can do more press-ups than him, or you're very clever. You've won, 5 Walkleys? He doesn't give a shit if you've won 20 Walkleys. You're just Ross at the gym.
Yeah,
and that there's a liberation in that. You're a lovely rooster, mate, and I wish you lots of valuable friendships in the future. There is one further final question. Who would you like to hear on Five My Life next, and why?
A lot of us outside of New Zealand really admire her, but friends of mine who still live in New Zealand loathe her. And a lot of them are lefties. And I think she'd be fascinating to see whether or not she's got the willingness to be open and candid about mistakes. I've made mistakes. Boy, do journalists make mistakes. I've made mistakes. Politicians don't like often admitting mistakes. Scott Morrison seems to have a problem with admitting he made mistakes with Robodebt, for example. Wouldn't it be magnanimous of him to just basically say, "Look, we cocked up. We made a mistake.
Just totally stuffed that up.
I've made a terrible
what were we
mistake."
thinking?
And that's what I was hoping was going to happen when he was asked about it the other week. But I'm fascinated with Jacinta Ardern because I've got friends who've worked for her and they know her quite well, and I think she would be a fascinating interview.
Ross Coulthart, thank you so much for coming on Five My Life and sharing your choices.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you follow Five of My Life, you might enjoy my latest book, Smart, Stupid and 60. In it, I write about a number of the issues discussed on the show. It's the 20-year follow-on from my first book, Fat, 40 and Fired. If you have any feedback on the book or suggestions for the show, please get in touch via my website, nigelmarsh.com.